This is my book, copies of which are indeed for sale afterwards, especially discounted price, and I will sign every copy if you buy it. You might think, looking at the cover, that it is a book about the River Thames. I can see that you might make that mistake. That's deliberate. It's not a book about the Thames. There are lots of books about the Thames, and some of them are very good. This is a book about London's water supply. But it doesn't say that, because if you put a history of water supply on the front cover of a book, I can guarantee that nobody will buy it. So the publishers and I have engaged in a little bit of creative subterfuge. I hope, if you do read it, that you will find that it is by no means a dry subject, despite its title. Water supply turns out to be absolutely fascinating, because supplying water to a big city like London involves so many different things. It's a history of water supply is a social history, it's a political history, it's a technological history. Yes, there is stuff about pumps and pipes in it. It's a history of science, it's a history of personal hygiene, it's a history of laundry. It's a political history, because certainly in the 19th century, London's water supply was an intensely political subject. And there is also a chapter in the book about Richmond, very specifically. Not many corners of London merit a chapter themselves in my book, but Richmond does. So there's lots and lots in the book, and of course I can only talk about a little bit of that this evening. So I'm not going to talk, for instance, about the history of local government in London and its impact on the water supply, though there is a chapter about that. I'm not going to talk about fraudulent accounting in Victorian business, though there is a chapter about that. I'm not going to talk about what one water company did in 1866 when it discovered, or it was told, that its product was quite literally killing thousands of its customers. If you want to know about that, you'll have to buy the book. So what am I going to talk about? Well, I'm going to talk about that for a start. This is the New River, which is not new, and it's not a river. It flows through North London, and it's not a river because it's an aqueduct, which was dug originally to bring fresh water from springs in Hertfordshire to the City of London. And it's not new because it was completed over 400 years ago in 1613. And it is still, astonishingly, a fully functioning part of London's water supply. 10% of London's water comes down the New River every day. And these days, it originates at a point on the River Lee, about halfway between Hertford and Ware. If you walk along the towpath, you come to this building. It's called New Gauge. It was built in the 1850s. And through that aperture, every day flows a maximum of 22.5 million gallons out of the Lee into the New River. And it winds its way through North London, places like Enfield and Winchmore Hill. It was originally more than 40 miles long because it hugged the 100-foot contour to the west of the River Lee, flowing very, very gently, descending 5 inches a mile, flowing by gravity down towards the City of London. Since then, first of all, it's been straightened out a bit, so it's rather shorter. And secondly, it now stops short. It used to go as far as Clerkenwell. It now stops short near my home in Stoke Newington. And if you want to know how I got interested in this, I was fascinated by the traces that the river has left on the landscape in Hackney, Stoke Newington, and Islington. Below the point, south of the point where it now stops, at a couple of reservoirs, you can still find traces of it in the parks and the street pattern and in features of the landscape. And I was fascinated by that. I wanted to know more about it. And I went the long way around finding out more, which is to write a book about it. It was created by a fascinating man called Hugh Middleton, who was an Elizabethan Jacobean goldsmith, which meant that he was the early modern equivalent of a banker. And this is a statue of him on Islington Green in North London, close to the route of the New River. It was put up by the Victorians, and it's one of at least 4 statues of Middleton they put up. There's another one in the foyer of Islington Town Hall. There's one on the Royal Exchange opposite the Bank of England, and there's one on one of the 4 corners of Holborn Viaduct. The Victorians understood that Middleton was, first of all, a very effective, energetic entrepreneur, and he was also a go-getter, the sort of person that the Victorians rather liked, and that he was also a very considerable benefactor of London, because he was the man really who first secured a reliable source of clean drinking water for the City of London. And he did it by overseeing the construction of this river and raising the money for it. And he turned to a number of his wealthy colleagues among the city merchant aristocracy to fund it. He sold them shares. Selling shares in 1613 was a very novel idea. The idea of a joint stock company had been around for probably about 30, 40 years, but joint stock companies tended to be one-offs. A bunch of merchants would get together and they would invest in a trading voyage. They'd take shares in the trading voyage. And then at the end of the voyage, the ships would return, the goods would be sold off, and the merchants would take their capital back out again. The New River Company, which Hugh Middleton established with these shareholders, was almost certainly the first permanent joint stock company in Britain. It was the first share issuing company which had permanent capital. And that makes it the forerunner of virtually every subsequent modern business corporation. It provided one of the templates. And Middleton deserves to be remembered by us not merely as a far-sighted entrepreneur, but also as somebody who pioneered a new way of doing business. Who were these shareholders? Well, here are 2 of them. The one on the right was a man called Peter Van Law, who was a Dutchman originally, and he was probably the richest commoner in England in the reign of James I. At one point, he sold James I £19,000 worth of jewellery. £19,000 was an absolutely astronomical sum. It was more than the New River cost to build, and Van Law sold that many jewels to James I. And the one on the left is a man called Sir John Backhouse, and he was brought into the project because the New River ran down to a reservoir in between Islington and Clerkenwell, on a sort of elevated position just north of the City of London, and Backhouse owned the land at which it terminated, and he owned the reservoir in which the New River water collected. And he was obviously rather proud of his connection with the project, because when he had his portrait painted, he got the artist to include a little landscape drawing of New River Head, it was called. So his hand is resting on a picture of the circular reservoir at New River Head, the irregularly shaped original duck pond that surrounded it, and a building in the middle known as the Waterhouse, which contained the cocks, the taps, and so on, which controlled the flow of water to the New River Company's customers. There was one other very important shareholder, and that was the King, James I. During the construction of the New River, some of the landowners along the way started cutting up rough, and it looked for a time as if they would get an act of Parliament which would rescind the act under which gave Middleton the authority to build this river. And Middleton stymied the opponents by going straight to the King. And James I, of course, was desperate to find a source of revenue which would make him independent of Parliament, just as his son Charles I was later. And Middleton said to him, "I will give you a half share in the New River Company if you agree to put up half the cost of constructing it, and then I will give you half the profits." And that sounded to James like a good deal, and it was a good deal, and so they agreed. Charles I made many mistakes as king. One of his more egregious was, on succeeding his father, to look at this half share in the New River Company and decide that actually it wasn't making him enough money. It had paid back about half of his father's initial investment, but he thought he wanted immediate cash. So he sold his 50% share in the New River Company back to Hugh Middleton for £500 down and £500 a year in perpetuity. When I tell you that the New River Company was not only one of the very first modern business corporations in Britain, but was also the most profitable company in British history, you will understand that this was a stupid thing for Charles I to do. Was it the most profitable? Well, an historian in the 1980s looked at the record of the New River Company and worked out that if one of those original shareholders had, by some miracle, survived all the way through from the early 17th century to 1904, when the New River Company, along with the other private London water companies, was taken into public ownership by the Metropolitan Water Board, he, and of course they were all men, he would have enjoyed a return on his initial investment in terms of accumulated dividends down the decades, down the centuries, and the final payment. He would have enjoyed a return on his initial investment of 267% per year. Figures absolutely staggering, and I don't believe there is any investment in British history, honest investment, that can possibly have returned such an amount of money over a long period. I showed you the picture within the picture of New River Head. That's another picture of it. In sometime probably in the 1660s, there was a circular reservoir behind that wall. There was the original duck pond, which was adapted for the New River, surrounding it, and the waterhouse. In the distance, you can see Old St. Paul's. So we know that this picture was taken before the Great Fire of 1666. And there's another picture showing New River Head sometime in the first half of the 18th century. You can see the round reservoir, the little house next to it, a larger irregular secondary reservoir around it. You can also see Christopher Wren's St. Paul's in the background, and you can see a windmill, or what looks like a windmill. It doesn't have any sails. That's because it was a disastrous experiment. It was put up in about 1704, I think, and it had originally 6 sails, which is more than the standard 4, and they blew off not once but twice in storms. So they abandoned the windmill and replaced it with a horse mill, the horse going round and round and round at the base of the windmill to drive a pump. Why did they need a pump? Well, because the New River originally served just the City of London, and its water flowed not only from Hertfordshire to New River Head, but then down to its customers in pipes entirely by gravity. No pumping was involved. One reason why the New River Company was so profitable, because pumping is a very expensive business. But London was growing, it was expanding to the west. The New River Company wanted to serve places like Bloomsbury and Soho and Covent Garden, but it found it didn't have enough water pressure to get its water out to the west like that. So it built a second reservoir up the hill from its original reservoir, and you can see that in the foreground there, the rectangular reservoir. And that provided a head of pressure which took the water to the west, but of course they had to find a way to pump the water up from the original reservoir to the secondary reservoir, and that's why the windmill and the horse mill. That secondary reservoir also still exists. It's in a square next to Pentonville Road called Claremont Square. It's still part of London's water supply. It's covered over these days. And that picture I find entertaining because it was done by a British artist, and it's a pretty accurate topographical drawing of that part of North London. The great Italian artist Canaletto, who spent quite a lot of time in England, also did a version of that prospect, that landscape. But Canaletto, you may think, as I did, that Canaletto's precision as a draftsman wonderful, wonderful precision, meant that his depictions of the world were accurate. They're not. Canaletto decided that that reservoir in the foreground was in the wrong place. So he moved it about 200 yards to the right, thought it would make a better picture. Never been able to look at a picture by Canaletto the same light since. That's a picture of New River Head shortly before it disappeared. That was taken just before the First World War. Round Pond, the original waterhouse, somewhere in that cluster of buildings to the right. The outer pond by the 20th century had been turned into filter beds for purifying the water. And that's what replaced it. That building still stands in Rosebery Avenue. It was built as the headquarters for the Metropolitan Water Board. And it practically obliterated all of the New River Head complex, certainly that circular reservoir, with two exceptions. One was the windmill. That little round building behind the New River Head complex in Rosebery Avenue is what is left of that windmill and its subsequent life as a horse mill. And behind it, on the left, you can see a structure put up in the latter part of the 18th century to house a steam-driven pumping engine, which was designed by the celebrated engineer John Smeaton. And that is the oldest surviving steam pumping station or steam engine house of any kind in London. So that's an important monument to the Industrial Revolution. And I'm pleased to say that after decades of sitting empty and unloved, both of those buildings are going to be taken over next year, all being well, by an outfit called the Quentin Blake Centre for Illustration. They're going to become a museum of book illustration. The other survival of New River Head, the old New River Head, is inside that great big 1920s Metropolitan Water Board headquarters. And it's called the Oak Room, and it gives you some idea of quite what the New River Company thought of itself and the status that it had. This was created, this room, in the 1690s in that little old waterhouse, and it was known originally as the courtroom. It's where the court of directors, where the board met of the New River Company, and it is absolutely splendid. In the ceiling, there is a portrait of the king at the time, William III. There is a whole lot of elaborate plasterwork. There is oak panelling, which has been exquisitely carved, possibly by Grinling Gibbons. It's an interior that speaks of, first of all, wealth. You have to have money to commission something like this, but also of status. The people who commissioned this thought highly of themselves. And certainly at the turn of the 17th and 18th centuries, there were really only three joint stock companies in Britain of any significance. One was the East India Company, one was the Bank of England, and the third was the New River Company. What happened before the New River, you ask, if you've been paying attention? Well, the answer to that was that people had wells in their back gardens, or they went down to the Thames and dipped a bucket in if they wanted water, or they queued up at the conduits. Medieval London had a series of pipes coming into the city from springs around the outskirts, which culminated at sometimes quite elaborate conduit houses like this. There were eventually 16. And you could go, or you could send your servant to the conduit to get water, or you could wait for the water bearers, the water carriers, to bring it to you. And you can see a water bearer there with his tankard over his shoulder. There's another picture of a London water bearer. The tankards held about 3 gallons, and they went round from house to house selling water to the householders. But between 1500 and 1600, the population of London quadrupled, went from about 50,000 to about 200,000, and there wasn't enough water to go round. So novel thinking was required. And the first person who tried to solve this problem was a Dutchman. He was called Peter Moritz, and he came with probably German technology, some clever new pump, and he started something called the London Bridge Waterworks. This is a picture of two pictures of old London Bridge, and I know it doesn't look like it, but the structure you can see in both cases is the same bridge. On the top, you have the kind of classic old London bridge, medieval bridge with all the houses on it. Those were swept away in the 18th century, and what was left was what you see in the bottom picture. Both pictures, you look to the left-hand northern end of the bridge, you can see a sort of wooden structure. That is protecting the water wheels of the London Bridge Waterworks, which occupied several of the arches and turned with the tide, pumping, driving pumps, which then pumped river water up into a tank, which was distributed to customers in the city. And Peter Moritz, rather like Middleton, was a pioneer in ways of doing business. What he did was he laid pipes through the streets of the medieval city, and he invited people living in houses past which his pipes ran to put a connection into his pipe so they could take water directly into their own home. And the only requirement, obviously, was that they paid him. And in the process, really, he invented something which we take for granted, which is the networked utility. We all pay money for our gas, for our electricity, for our water, for our telephone. We're very familiar with this idea. Moritz, I think, was the first person who created a business that was a networked utility. And the London Bridge Waterworks survived right through until the time in 1831 when Old London Bridge was demolished. That's a picture of it in about 1828, I think. You can see the water wheels at the northern end and the old bridge shortly before it disappeared, the monument to the fire there dominating the skyline. There was a problem, which was that by the 1820s, and I'll come back to this a little bit later, the River Thames had become horribly polluted. And there is evidence given by the superintendent of the London Bridge Waterworks in the 1820s to a parliamentary inquiry into London's water supply. In the 19th century, there were endless inquiries into London's water supply because it clearly wasn't satisfactory. And royal commissions and parliamentary select committees constantly looked at it. The superintendent was asked in the 1820s about the quality of the water supplied by the London Bridge Waterworks. He said it's very good quality. People like it. They prefer it to new river water, he said, because it's softer and therefore better for doing the laundry. But what about drinking it, he was asked. Oh, I never dream of drinking it, he said. Those pipes, which ran largely underground in the city's streets, were made of wood. Elm pipes, hollowed out, joined end to end, thin end of one slotted into the thick end of the next. You'll not be surprised to learn that they leaked quite a lot, but elm was chosen because elm doesn't rot. It's particularly resistant, stays very solid even when wet. Occasionally these pipes ran overground. This is a picture of the New River Company's pipes running west across the valley of the River Fleet towards Bloomsbury. There's another picture of them crossing the Fleet itself and leaking. Small boys apparently used to go around deliberately making holes in the pipes in order to watch the fountains. And the people who bought water, whether it was from the London Bridge Company or the New River Company, didn't have water on tap as we do 24 hours. What happened was that the water companies employed chaps like this. They were called turncocks. And they went around the streets on a regular schedule and they would turn the water on for a couple of hours in each street every couple of days. So you had to know when the turncock would be coming round, and you had to have one of these, a lead or zinc cistern or a wooden water butt. This is a picture of a courtyard of a London house in St Martin's Lane in the 1820s, done by a wonderful artist called George Scharf. It's his backyard. There you can see he has the family water butt. Above it there's a tap and a pipe which is coming in from the main in the street, which would deliver water when the turncock ensured that St Martin's Lane was getting its supply, and there's a tap at the bottom for drawing off water for cooking or for washing or for doing the laundry, and it's very convenient to the family privy, which is in the corner there. Not so good if you were poor. was all right if you were a middle-class householder and you had somewhere to store your water. Not so good if you lived in a slum, possibly one whole family in one room. You had a number of options in that case. You could, if you were lucky, get water from a standpipe like this one in the slum courtyard that your landlord would pay the water company for, and you would then pay the landlord. Part of your rent would go towards the water. Or you could queue up at the parish pump, which was free, but there was a queue. Or if you were particularly unlucky, your landlord might provide a communal cistern or water butt. And these were absolutely revolting. They were renowned for being filthy. Small boys would play games in them. People would wash their chamber pots in them. People went to any lengths often not to have to use the water from the communal water butt, particularly for cooking. Not surprisingly, as London grew, and given the profitability of the new river company, other water companies started up as well, all of them getting their water either from the River Thames or from the River Lee. And this was one of the first of them. This is called the York Buildings Waterworks, and it's sat more or less where Charing Cross Station sits now. You can see the gate, the rather elaborate rusticated gate, is the old water gate of York House, the palace of the Dukes of York, which is still there. It's in Embankment Gardens. It doesn't have its feet in the water anymore because they built the embankment in front of it, but it's still there. The waterworks is long gone. It had that rather striking obelisk-shaped water tower, standpipe. And just away to the right, you can see a smoking chimney. And this, like the New River Company engine house at New River Head, this is historically important because even before the New River, the York Buildings Waterworks was in the business of steam. The York Buildings Waterworks installed the very first steam engine in London. Very quickly uninstalled it because the coal bill was absolutely enormous and they realized they couldn't afford it. But they deserve credit for having pioneered steam power in London in the 1740s. And in due course, lots of other water companies started up along the Thames. So there's York Buildings in the middle there. Top left, you have the Lambeth Waterworks, whose intake was where the Royal Festival Hall is now. Top right, you have the Southwark Waterworks, whose intake was where Southwark Bridge is now. Bottom left, you have the Chelsea Waterworks, whose intake was underneath the railway line into Victoria, and indeed Victoria Station was built on the Chelsea Waterworks reservoir. Water company moved upriver and the railway company simply took the site over. Bottom right, slightly later, the Southwark and Vauxhall Waterworks, whose intake was where Battersea Power Station now lies. And again, the power station was built on the old waterworks. And most of those have gone, but there is one that still survives, and I recommend a visit to it because it's fascinating. It's also rather handsome. It's the Grand Junction Waterworks at Kew Bridge, just in Brentford, just by the South Circular Road as it crosses from Kew towards Chiswick. It has this very elegant campanile-like water standpipe. And it's home to the London Museum of Water and Steam. And I researched quite a lot of my book in the archive there. And they have lots of displays about the history of water. And they have steam pumping engines. Now, when I started researching this book, I was pretty indifferent, really, about steam engines. I couldn't quite understand why people got so excited. Then I saw these, and I'm in love. They're extraordinary. They're absolutely vast. You can't possibly photograph them. They've got three steam engines at Kew Bridge. They've got more, but three which were originally built for that and installed in that site. So in two cases, I think the building was actually constructed around them because they're so enormous. They're beautiful pieces of Victorian engineering. They're absolutely wonderful to look at. And when they are in operation, they're awesome in their sort of power and elegance. And they're monuments to Victorian industrial might. This picture was taken in the yard of Harvey's, a firm in Hale in North Cornwall that made Cornish steam pumping engines. And this is the cylinder of the largest steam pumping engine ever made. It was actually made for a pumping station in Holland. And I love this photograph because it bespeaks industrial might. So many things about 19th century Britain. Industrial might, world domination. It was made for export, and also kind of class distinctions, because here you have the Victorian class system displayed in front of you. Old man Harvey is standing there in his top hat, very well dressed in the middle. On the left, you have a middle manager wearing his bowler hat. And on the right, in his flat cap, you have the foreman holding up the scale, which tells you that this monster was fully 12 feet across, absolutely enormous. As I say, there was money to be made in water, and so the fat cats got interested. Regency businessmen, sharks, most of them, and a whole raft of new water companies were floated in London in the years after 1810 to serve the growing populace. But they were greedy men, but they were also actually rather short-sighted. We now know in the modern world that water supply is what economists call a natural monopoly. It makes no sense to have competing water companies vying with one another to supply a particular street with water. They learnt that the hard way in the early 19th century in London. At one stage, in parts of London, 3 different water companies were all competing for the same custom, all laying pipes down the streets, all investing money, and creating what one historian called water wars in London, very fierce water wars. And it was a disaster. Nobody made any money. Even the new river company didn't actually go into loss, but its dividends plummeted dramatically. And there were dirty tricks employed both by the customers who would play one company off against another and by the companies themselves. There were stories of rival gangs of workmen from different companies fighting in the streets, fighting in the trenches, the pipe trenches and so on. It was a disaster. So in 1817, north of the river, rather later south of the river, all these competing companies, rather shamefully, came to a secret agreement among themselves not to compete. They weren't supposed to do this. Most of them had acts of parliament which, in one way or another, outlawed this, but they ignored that because they decided it was in their long-term interests to form a series of local monopolies, an oligopoly. And so they carved the city up between them. The New River Company took the City of London and North London. The East London Waterworks took East London. The West Middlesex Waterworks and the Grand Junction Waterworks took most of the West End between them. The Chelsea Waterworks took Chelsea and Westminster. The Kent Waterworks took the southeast. The Southwark and Vauxhall Waterworks took the area south of the Thames. And the Lambeth Waterworks took the rest of South London. And the Southwark and Vauxhall and the Lambeth were the only water companies which still, for a part of their area, still competed directly with one another, which is significant for a reason we'll come back to in a little while. So they formed this oligopoly, and guess what they did? The moment they'd done it, they put their prices up by 25%, and the customers were furious. And this is a cartoon produced in the 1820s. It's part of an anti-water company campaign, decrying the monopoly that had been established. It's called John Bull's Waterworks, or Unfeeling Speculators Threatening to Cut Off One of the Necessities of Life. And it is, frankly, not to put too fine a point on it, a riot of cock jokes, because each of these people is a water company customer. Each of them has a cock on their water butt or water tank, and the chaps with axes are water company turncocks who are coming along threatening to cut the cocks off unless people pay the extortionate prices they're demanding. Two little boys at the back, one of them, poor little fellow, has already lost his cock, the other one is about to lose his cock. John Bull on the right, he's, I'll pay anything within reason to keep it, you know, don't cut it off. And did you mention sex in the introduction, Simon? Somebody came up to me one of these talks and said, is there any sex in your book? And I said, there's no sex in my book, it's a book about water supply. And then I remembered this. The lady straddling the cock is saying, it's a hard case to pay so very dear for our waterworks. I'm determined to protect my husband's cock. You shan't cut it off if I can help it. Be off with you, Mr. Turncock. But what she's saying seems to be slightly belied by her posture. Don't you think her skirt has risen rather suggestively far up her leg? You do wonder if the implication is that if the turncock is kind to her, he may get some sort of personal reward. And floating in the middle of the thing is a little piece of paper on which is written, "Bill in Parliament to authorise certain parishes to supply themselves with water to check the extortions of the monopolising companies." And this is one of the very earliest appearances in public of an idea which had sort of formed in campaigners' minds around this time, which was that maybe, just maybe, it would be a good idea for something so important as water supply not to be in the hands of private profit-making companies, but to be in some sort of public ownership for the public interest. And that was the issue, essentially, that dominated water politics in London for the rest of the century. It took 70 years from the conception of this idea to its fulfillment in 1904, but that was one of the kind of themes running through London's water politics for the century. The other one, sorry, I've gone too far. The other one was that the water was absolutely filthy. The stuff that people were being given, most of which was pumped out of the Thames, was disgusting. It was disgusting because a clever fellow had invented the flushing water closet, which overwhelmed the traditional cesspits into which people's household waste had previously gone. So the water closets were directed into sewers, which emptied into the Thames. And huge quantities of untreated sewage was finding its way into the Thames. This was the stuff that was being pumped up and served up to people. And this is a pamphlet, also from the 1820s, the Dolphin or Grand Junction Nuisance, highlighting this issue. A dolphin, I didn't know this till I came across this pamphlet, a dolphin is a wooden structure in water which is there as a protection, basically. And the dolphin in this case is the little thing that looks like a hexagonal garden shed, and it is protecting the intake pipe of the Grand Junction Waterworks. The Grand Junction's pumping station is there on the right with its smoking chimney, with its steam engine. That's not the one I showed you a photograph of earlier. This is an earlier pumping station, which was then later moved upriver. And on the left, you can see the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, and in between, you can see the Ranelagh sewer. And the author of the pamphlet pointed out that the water company intake was at the mouth of the sewer. And so anything that came down the sewer was getting pumped, sucked into the intake, and then pumped out to the Grand Junction Waterworks customers. And he said as a result that they were being served a fluid saturated with the impurities of 50,000 houses, a dilute solution of animal and vegetable substances in a state of putrefaction, alike offensive to the sight, disgusting to the imagination, and destructive to health. And he wasn't wrong. He was absolutely right, and the scientists proved it. Pioneering microscopist called Arthur Hassel in 1851 produced a book about London's water. He analysed all the waters that were being supplied by the London water companies, and he demonstrated that they were full of all sorts of little animals, and we will call them bacteria and so on, but also that they were full of things like part-digested muscle fibers that he concluded could only have got into the water via the human gut. And that provoked parodies from the cartoonists as well. This is called Monster Soup, commonly called Thames Water, being a correct representation of the precious stuff served up to us, and the lady is looking through her microscope at a sample of water full of all sorts of nasty beasties, and she's horrified. You can see her cup of tea is falling from her nerveless fingers because she's just realized what's in the water from which the tea was made. And the filth, the pollution of London's water became a kind of byword. This is a cartoon from, I think, the 1840s. This shows one of those turncocks, two little boys watching him at work, and one of them is saying, "I say, Tommy, I'm blowed if there isn't a man a turning on the cholera." And that's interesting because in the 1840s, the medical profession, the scientific profession, did not accept that cholera could possibly be waterborne. There were all sorts of theories about what cholera was, where it came from, and so on. But the idea that it might be something in the water simply wasn't countenanced. However, the public, as represented by newspaper cartoonists and others, were pretty convinced that there might be a link between cholera and water, which was pretty far-sighted of the public. The man who established that cholera was waterborne was this man. He was one of my heroes. He was called Dr. John Snow. He was a pioneer of epidemiology and also, as it happened, a pioneer of anesthetics. He gave anesthesia to Queen Victoria during one of her confinements when she was having one of her babies, and she pronounced herself well pleased. Made a big difference, apparently. And Snow lived in London during a cholera outbreak in 1854, which took place near his home in Soho. And the story goes, and it's a sort of slight element of myth about it. The story goes that he went round Soho plotting on a map where people had died of cholera. And this map showed that cholera deaths were clustering around one particular street in the middle of Soho called Broad Street, now called Broadwick Street. And in Broad Street there was a pump from which a lot of the local people were getting their water, and he surmised that the cholera was in the pump water, and he got the local authority to take the handle off the pump, and the cholera outbreak stopped. Now, that's the story. It's not quite that simple, but it's a good enough illustration of the sort of work that Snow did. And he did in the same year, 1854, there was another cholera outbreak in South London. He did an even more striking piece of work. You'll recall that that was the one part of the city where two water companies still competed with one another to supply water. So you had houses next door to one another, which were identical in every respect, except that they were getting their water from different companies. And he found that in households that took water from the Southwark and Vauxhall Company, the number of deaths from cholera was 10 times that of households who got their water from the Lambeth Company. And he took that as evidence that there was cholera in the Southwark and Vauxhall water, but not in the Lambeth water. And you and I might think that that was a pretty convincing demonstration. The tragedy, really, is for him and for many others, is that the medical profession, when presented with this evidence, still refused to accept it. And Snow died in 1859, still something of a pariah, I was putting it too strongly, but his theory was simply not accepted. It wasn't until the 1860s that wise heads suddenly began to say, you know what, I think Snow was right. Maybe there is something in this. Maybe cholera is in the water. Why, you wonder, is there this difference between the Southwark and Vauxhall and the Lambeth water? Well, the Lambeth Water Company had moved its intake 2 years previously from the site of the Royal Festival Hall to a place called Seething Wells, just upriver from Kingston. And that was significant because it was outside, upstream from the tidal Thames. The problem with the tidal Thames is all the sewage went into it, And you might think, well, it would then be swept out to sea. But of course, because the Thames is tidal, twice a day, all the surge would get down, and then it would come back up again. And there are stories of dead cats and dogs floating up and down for days at an end. The stuff got into the river and it never got out. And another of my heroes, the chief engineer of the Lambeth Waterworks, a man called James Simpson, concluded that there was absolutely no way that he could purify this water, and the only solution was to move the company's intake to somewhere where the water was much clearer, upstream from Teddington Lock. And he persuaded his directors to do that. It cost them a lot of money, but then London was growing, there was opportunities for making more money. And by 1854, the Lambeth's water was clean, the Southwark and Vauxhall water was still coming out of the river at Battersea and was still full of cholera. Simpson did one other thing. He was the first man to filter London's water, to purify it. He was chief engineer of two companies, the Lambeth and the Chelsea Company. And in the 1820s, he installed what were called slow sand filters, which are layers of gravel and sand, and you flood the top of them with water, and the water trickles through and out at the bottom, and it comes out clean. Goes in dirty, comes out clean. And Thames Water still uses slow sand filters to purify 2/3 of London's water. This is a picture of one of those filter beds being cleaned, because periodically the sand the sort of growth would form on the top of it, and they would wash the sand to clean it. And this is taken at Hampton, which is still a very important waterworks. And you can see receding into the distance there the rather elaborate pumping stations belonging to three of the water companies, the Grand Junction, the West Middlesex, and the Southwark and Vauxhall. The Chelsea and the Lambeth companies went upriver to Seething Wells. The government in 1852 told all the water companies that the first time government had finally been persuaded, after decades of campaigning, to take an interest, to take some steps to do something about London's water. It insisted, first of all, that any company taking water out of the Thames or the Lee had to move its intake up to the non-tidal part, and secondly, that they all had to filter this water, which many of them had not been doing up until that point. So this was a picture of the Hampton Waterworks in the 1890s. Simpson thought that his filters worked mechanically. They were just basically straining the bits out. We now know they work biologically. What happens is that on the top of the filter bed, there forms something known by the delightful German word of a Schmutzdecke, which I'm told means slime blanket. This is basically a bunch of good bugs which form on the top of the filter bed and eat all the bad bugs. And 98% of the bad bugs disappear from the water. It comes out the bottom 98% clean. And as London grew, more and more of these intakes were built upriver from Teddington. This one is opposite Runnymede, dates rather handsome set of buildings, dates from the very early part of the 20th century, about 1904, I think. This rather more utilitarian one is at Datchet and is much more modern. There are, I think, 10 intakes now on the Thames upriver from Teddington. A lot of the water that came out of those newer intakes was processed at this waterworks at Kempton, which is next to the flyover leading to the M3. Close to Kempton Racecourse, not very far from Hampton. And in that building I said I'd fallen in love with steam engines. This is the steam engine to end steam engines. This was installed in the 1920s inside that building. It's one of a pair. It's the biggest steam engine, I think, most powerful steam engine, if I got this right, ever installed by London Water Company. And it's absolutely massive. It's about, as you can see, it's about 5 stories high. And they steam that from time to time on open days at Kempton. And again, it's well worth going. Which brings me briefly to Richmond, because, as I said, I think Richmond figures in the book And the reason for that was that Richmond, outside of the metropolitan area, so not theoretically part of the metropolitan London water supply, was supplied in the 1860s and early 1870s by one of those London water companies, the Southwark and Vauxhall, which had taken over a local waterworks in Richmond and had offered to improve the supply, which came from its pumping station at Battersea. Unfortunately, Battersea is quite a long way from Richmond, and in 1871, I think, the historic Star and Garter Hotel, a very popular resort of Londoners, nice place to go for a meal and a slap-up dinner and so on, burnt down. And there was a local fire brigade in Richmond Parish Fire Brigade. They got to the scene of the fire up the hill there, but they couldn't find any water. There was no water, and someone had to be sent on a horse 3 miles to Battersea to get the water turned on, by which time, of course, it was far too late. And that began a period of several years in which gradually the local authority in Richmond, the vestry, and the water company, the Southwark and Vauxhall, ended up at daggers drawn. And the culmination of this came in 1877. This is not, incidentally, a photograph of Richmond. I just love this photograph. This is pipe laying in the 1890s. It culminated in 1877, January 1877, by the water company deliberately deciding to cut off the supply to the entire town. The vestry had been trying to put its own alternative supply in place, but that supply wasn't ready. There were various problems the vestry was facing. The Southwark and Vauxhall directors feared that they were going to lose money if they carried on supplying Richmond, so they just walked away. And their engineer came round one night and cut off the town. I won't go into all the details. It's quite a complicated story, and apart from anything else, it's very difficult to illustrate. But it's, to me, frankly, jaw-dropping that any water company could have done this, leaving however many inhabitants there were. I say in the book, quoting a Victorian source, there were 20,000 people in Richmond. I don't think there were probably quite that many, but there were certainly many thousand people living in Richmond at the time who had no alternative source of water. And many of them didn't have an alternative source of water for up to a year, until the vestry finally got its act together and managed to put its own water supply in place. And I start the book with it because it seems to me the most striking example I could find of the perils of leaving something as important as public water supply in the hands of a private water company. The one thing I will just say is that this chap played the most extraordinary role. This is a picture from his obituary of Sir Charles Burt, former mayor of Richmond, local worthy, widely admired, splendid fellow. Burt was a member of the vestry committee which decided to start an alternative water supply to take over from the Southwark and Vauxhall. Burt was also the Southwark and Vauxhall company's lawyer. And it is, nothing brings it home to you the extent to which standards in public life have shifted, or had shifted perhaps until quite recently. They seem to be going back in the other direction. But in the Victorian era, it was apparently quite possible for someone to play an extraordinarily important and influential role on both sides of a dispute like this. There were complaints from fellow members of the vestry, but he stayed in place for a very long time, even though people were saying, you can't do this. And the company didn't seem to worry. The company, I think, probably felt that he was giving them useful intelligence about what was going on in Richmond. And that this conflict of interest was allowed, I find absolutely astonishing. Anyway, as I say, if you want to know more about that, it's in the book, along with lots of other things. I will be delighted, if you want to buy a copy of the book, to sign it for you, and I will also be delighted to answer any questions if you have them.
Questions, comments, please?
You'll have to Speak. Oh, no, the man's got to get back to the fader. Conrad's got to get to his buttons.
You'll have to tell us where the Richmond got its water from.
Richmond, Richmond hoped to get its water from an artesian well, which had supplied the town when it was much smaller before the Southern and Vauxhall waterworks came along. And the well was disused because the Southern and Vauxhall was supplying water in a big pipe from Battersea. When there was a falling out between the company and the vestry decided to bring that well back into action. Unfortunately, someone had built a house over it, so they had to buy the house and install steam engines in the house and so on. But that was where it was coming from. When the well wasn't ready and the Southern and Vauxhall cut the supply off, they got water from all sorts of places, principally from an intake from the Thames, just downstream from the Richmond sewer outfall. So the sewer was emptying into the Thames just above. It was illegal, as I say, for a London water company to take water out of the tidal Thames, and of course the Thames at Richmond is still tidal, and they had to filter it. But Richmond, the Richmond vestry, was not a London water company, so it was not covered by this act. So it could take water out of the tidal Thames and supply it to its customers, and for in some cases for a year. That's what it did.
At that time, was it when Penn Pond was a reservoir?
Say again, sorry?
When Penn Pond in Richmond Park is listed as Thames water as a
Yes,
reservoir?
if you could speak.
The straight answer to that is I'm not sure. I don't know the local geography well enough, and the book was written during lockdown because I couldn't go on doing research. I couldn't travel, I couldn't go to libraries, I couldn't go to archives. Coming to Richmond to find out more about this episode was one of the things I was going to do. And I'm afraid answering questions like that fell victim. It's another victim of COVID. I thought that, I could wait to write the book, but who knows how long it's going to take. And I've done a lot of research. Yeah.
You mentioned the buildings and the reservoirs at Seething Wells and Hampton and also at Kempton Park. How much do they still play a part in actually supplying water and purifying? Because obviously some of the pumping stations aren't used in the same way now, but they obviously still function to some extent.
Yes, the old buildings at Hampton they're all being, they've been empty for a long time, and some of them are being repurposed as business premises and accommodation and so on. Some of them still looking for someone to take them on. But next to them, there is a very large and very important Thames water facility, which has pumping station, modern pumping stations, primary and secondary filters, these slow sand filters and so on. So that is one of London's principal water purification plants. Kempton, there is still quite a lot of water activity at Kempton, and not in the rather handsome building with the splendid steam engines. There are possibly plans to expand what happens at Kempton. I forget the details. I have read of a proposal, but they're both still very much in business. Seething Wells, there's nothing at Seething Wells now. Some of the original buildings are there. They belong to Kingston University. They've been reput. One is a gym. Some of them, again, are looking for new uses. Seething Wells, in fact, didn't prove to be an ideal intake because it's just downriver from where the River Mole comes into the Thames. And the Mole, it wasn't so much sewage as it was a lot of mud and dirt at times of flood. So they moved those intakes upriver again, and there is now a big, important water complex at Walton, which has taken the place of what happened at Seething Wells.
Very interesting, thank you.
Not at all, my pleasure. Lady down here had a question.
Thank you, Simon. Just a follow-up question from your remarks about Richmond. Did anybody track, from a public health point of view, either the mortality rate or the disease rate whilst the water was not being taken upstream, but notwithstanding that was filtered, just to understand more about public health?
Not that I'm aware, and my sources on this are largely from local newspapers and from the papers, the company, corporate records of the Southern Vauxhall Company. There was a public meeting because this issue clearly divided Richmond very much between those who thought that the water company, which had put its prices up, that was really what triggered the conflict between the vestry and the water company. The water company were rapacious and monopolists and shouldn't be allowed to get away with this. And so the vestry, should get in there. And those who said, are we sure the vestry can do the job as well? Spoiler, it couldn't. And about 30 years later, it had to go back to the Southern Vauxhall and say, please, can you give us a supply of water? Because we can't supply the town sufficiently. And there was a public meeting, which was obviously very, very noisy and showed the town very deeply divided. And the vestry wanted everybody to get behind their plan. And there was a local doctor who was vilified, this shades here of, Ibsen's Enemy of the People and so on, local doctor who said, no, this is not good. And a lot of the local people were very cross that suddenly they didn't have any water. You would be. And they thought that the vestry had mismanaged it. So it was a kind of fascinating local political row. But I don't know of any proper study. It was a bit early for that kind of systematic study of a question like this, particularly when local politics was so fraught. Somebody, I think over there, two gentlemen both in the back room.
Thank you for a fascinating talk, absolutely brilliant. Do I take it that really the whole of London was just a gigantic building site as all the pipework went in, then it rotted, it came out, it went back in again? We get very grumpy where one or two roads around Richmond are sort of stopped by Thames Water because there's a leak or something's failed. But you're quite right, the distribution system is what it's about. I mean, the source is one thing, but how do you supply it to 4 million houses?
The roads were constantly being dug up. It was worst when you had two or three companies competing in a single street, and particularly bad because often, and I'm not quite sure about this. One of those other things I wasn't able to pin down, but I think I'm right in saying that often, in order to connect or disconnect a new customer, you had to dig the road up. And so if you had a very fluid situation where people were signing on with a company for 6 months, then signing off again and so on, the road would constantly be dug up. There'd be holes in the road constantly just in order to connect, disconnect and reconnect customers. And there is nothing new about holes in the road. Nothing at all. Or about leaking mains. Yes.
Again, fascinating talk. Thanks very much. And as a teenager, I used to run at the New River Stadium in Haringey. So now I know why it's called the New River.
Indeed.
My question really is around the natural rivers that were in London, like the Fleet, that were built over, and I think there was a Conduit Street. I wondered if your book talks about that and and why those were built over and so on.
They were built over. You mentioned Conduit Street.
Conduit Street and also Fleet Street.
Yeah, Conduit Street, the name reflects the fact that it was along the route of one of those medieval conduits, which ran from a spring in basically roughly where Bond Street Tube Station is now in Oxford Street. The Lost Rivers, they were covered over because they'd all been turned into sewers. And sewer is a word whose meaning has changed. Sewer originally was simply a channel for taking rainwater away. So there was nothing particularly unpleasant or noxious about a sewer. It was just a drainage ditch. And then people started emptying their privies into sewers, and they became what we think of as a sewer. In other words, something with a great deal of unpleasant foul content. And the rivers were the Tyburn, the Westbourne, the Effra, the Neckinger, the Fleet. They were convenient sewers, and so they got covered over because they were full of excrement, basically, and they stank. And what happened was that the problem of the Thames itself being one huge great cesspit, as somebody described it, was solved in the 1860s by the Metropolitan Board of Works and the Joseph Bazalgette, the great engineer, who re-engineered the sewage system. Instead of all the raw sewage going into the Thames, he put in a series of parallel east-west sewers, north and south of the river, which went down to outfalls a long way downstream, Barking on the north bank, Crossness near Thamesmead on the south. So the stuff was taken away from central London. And all of these, and they were called intercepting sewers because they intercepted the flow of all the lost rivers, whose flow went into these intercepting sewers. And so the Thames itself became moderately clean. They intercepted it except at periods of very, very high rainfall. London is, unfortunately, one of a number of cities in this country which has what's called a combined sewer system, where both foul water from households and relatively clean surface water, rainwater, go into the same pipes. Most of the time it doesn't matter, but where there's a lot of rainfall, the system gets overwhelmed. And Bazalgette built weirs in where his river/sewer came down and joined one of his new intercepting sewers. All of the stuff would go into the intercepting sewer, except when the level reached a certain point at which it would tip over this weir and then go into the Thames. And part of London's problem today is that which Bazalgette assumed would happen maybe 6 or 7 times a year now happens very frequently because London is bigger, there are more people, more toilets emptying into the sewers. We paved over enormous amounts of our gardens and so on in order to park our cars or put patios, and so less and less rain soaks in to the ground and more of it runs off into the sewers, and the system is overwhelmed all the time. And that's why they're building this eye-wateringly expensive super sewer, the Thames Tideway Tunnel, underneath the Thames as a sort of Bazalgette intercepting sewer on steroids, which we're all going to pay for decades in our water bills, basically. Anybody else? Yes, lady with the stripes. Anybody else? I'm conscious that I'm keeping you from the tempting array of glasses and all those exciting dishes hidden under tea towels. Yes.
If you are a member of the Worshipful Company of Water Conservators, the initials are WCWC.
They are indeed. I know a number of members of the Worshipful Company of Water Conservators, and they have tried to persuade me that it would be worth my while paying whatever it is, 600 quid a year or something to be a member, but I've yet to be tempted. But I've been to one of their dinners and I've attended a few of their lectures, and they're an excellent outfit. They do good work.
I want to say that there's a question from Zoom. We've got over 30 people on Zoom. You'd be very pleased
hello.
to know.
I'd forgotten about you. Hello, Zoomers. Yes, I'm delighted.
And the question is that they said it was a fascinating talk. What's your next project research area?
Well, I have a meeting tomorrow with my agent, at which we will see whether he thinks this is a good idea. I want to write about British soldiers and spies in post-revolutionary Russia, the period 1917 to 1921. There were operating in Russia at that time a number of agents of the British state, some of whom were soldiers, some of whom were diplomats, some of whom were kind of overt intelligence agents, some of whom were spies, and they were a wonderful bunch. And extraordinary, some absolutely extraordinary stories.
Right. Well, what a change. Right. Any further questions or comments on the... No, just speaking to it.
Just curiously, you talk about the Richmond and the vestry and the whole punch-up with the Lambeth gang. That was in the 1870s, did you say?
Yes, January 1877, the water was cut off. So it was the first part of 1877 was when there was a lot of mudslinging within the town.
And when the Metropolitan Water Board was declared, was Richmond outside of that? So did the vestry continue as an independent set-up?
Richmond was part of the Metropolitan Water Board area, but I think I'm right. I know that up until the 1960s, Richmond was always treated by the Metropolitan Water Board as different. I can't remember the precise arrangement, but I think Richmond's water was still delivered by the Richmond Water Company, basically acting as an agent of the Metropolitan Water Board. So the Metropolitan Water Board supplied the water, but I have an idea, and it's possible that some of you may be able to help me with this, that you may have paid your bills in Richmond not to the Metropolitan Water Board, but to the Richmond Water Company.
In Hampton and Kingston and all the beautiful...
No, it's quite a small area. Not Hampton, not Kingston, basically... Kew Gardens down to Richmond and then up to Ham. That sort of, yeah, the immediate. It was the parish of Richmond because the local authority was the parish vestry, and so outside of the parish of Richmond, it would have been different. Whoa, well done. Now, if anybody would like a copy of the book, I am happy to sell you one and to sign it. And
that will reduce its value, no doubt. But there we are.